Hi everyone, it's Blake again with ChessPathways.com. Welcome back for another Endgame Essentials video. So just to recap, in part 1, we covered how to win winning positions where you have an overwhelming advantage, and we talked about the basic checkmates in chess with a queen and a rook. Today, this video is going to be all about pawn endgames. So what is a pawn endgame? A pawn endgame is a position where both players only have pawns remaining, except for the kings. And as you might imagine, it'd be pretty hard to give a checkmate with just the pawns themselves, although it does occasionally happen. But the primary goal that you're going to have in a pawn endgame is to promote your pawn to a queen so you can give checkmate to the king. And notice how everything kind of builds on itself when it comes to chess endgames. Last time we talked about how to do the queen and king checkmate against a king. So if you didn't know that, it wouldn't do you much good to get this queen. But because you do know that checkmate, you know that if you're in a pawn endgame and you can promote to a queen, you can be confident that you'll be able to deliver checkmate. So let's start out by talking about what a passed pawn is. A passed pawn is a pawn that has no enemy pawns on its 3-lane path to promotion. That's how I would describe it. So we see this pawn white has here is a passed pawn. That means there's no black pawns anywhere here, right? Because if there were any pawns on any of those squares, they would be able to stop this pawn from queening. A pawn on the B file would make this pawn get stuck, right? And a pawn on the C or A file would have the choice to capture our pawn if we tried to just march our pawn forward and make a queen. But there are no pawns anywhere on those squares, so this pawn is a passed pawn. And in pawn endgames, passed pawns are much, much more powerful than pawns that are not passed pawns. Because if you have a passed pawn, the only thing your opponent can do to stop it from queening is to use their king. No pawns are going to be able to help them stop that pawn. Now let's talk about a concept called the square of the passed pawn. This is just a quick and easy way to see, can your opponent's king catch the pawn if you simply have the plan of marching your pawn up and making a queen. And how you do this is just draw a line diagonally to the edge of the board from the pawn, both directions. We see here it doesn't go all the way, that's okay. And then you just draw the square that goes from there back to the rank of the pawn. So the square of the pawn we're talking about here is really this rectangle here. And if the opponent's king can get into this rectangle, the opponent's king will be able to stop the pawn. But if it cannot, that means our pawn is free to march to promotion. So if it was black's turn here, black would be able to move the king into this square, and our pawn would not be able to promote without the king's help. But because it's white's turn, let's go ahead and move our pawn forward 1. And we see that the black king can now not get into this square. The king is too far away. And so white has a very simple win here. The king can do whatever it wants, but the king is not close enough to stop our pawn from promoting. Here we can choose either a queen or a rook. Of course, I always recommend a queen unless there's a good reason not to. So let's go ahead and make a queen. And we know this is a win for white. I'll just do it very quickly to recap on the last video. Let's use the L-shape method this time. Why not? Let's cut the king off here. We already have an L shape. Let's waste a move. Now we follow the king's actions wherever he goes. Now he's on the back rank. We just have to keep him there. Now our king comes up. And finally, checkmate is delivered. That's the L-shape method. For more on that, of course, review the last video. But the important thing here to notice was the square of the pawn. So here's our next position. It's white's turn here. Let's go ahead and think about if this is a win for white, a draw, or a win for black. And what would you do here if you were white? Go ahead and pause if you want some time to think about it. Okay, so this position is a win for white because we can march our pawn forward and the opponent's king will be outside of the square of this pawn. And we are inside the square of black's passed pawn. So let's go ahead and march our pawn forward. If black does the same, notice here we don't want to just, we move here, they move here, we make a queen, they make a queen, right? Because we have something better. We can actually stop their pawn from promoting. We can just come here. And now we can stop their pawn, but they cannot stop ours, and this will be a win for us. Black does have another idea. Instead of just marching his pawn, he can try to bring his king closer to help. So this is a common thing in pawn endgames. The king can help support a pawn if the opponent king is close enough that you can't just march the pawn itself. It needs the king's help. And now the king controls all these squares. Now the pawn is safe to march. Our king can't ever stop that pawn or capture it, but of course it's just too slow. We're making a queen. They can start marching, but we are going to be able to check the king away. He can try to stay close, but it's not going to do him much good. For example, we can move here, and the king is already forced to abandon the pawn. The king has no legal moves. that stay in touch with the pawn, and it will be a simple queen and king checkmate. And this is often the case in these king and pawn endgames, where both sides have passed pawns. A lot of times whoever makes their queen first is, of course, going to win the game. One of the most powerful uses of a passed pawn in these endgames is as a diversion. So here we have this position. We see that the black king is in the square of our passed pawn. Now, one interesting thing here, when our pawn is on the second rank, the square is actually smaller than you might think, because you have to remember this pawn gets a move of 2. So we really want to draw the square one square ahead. But we see, of course, the king is in the square of this pawn. So we can't just march the pawn forward and win like that. But because there's these pawns on the other side of the board, we can use this pawn as a diversion. Remember, when we have a passed pawn, that's going to attract the attention of the enemy king, because the king is the only thing that can stop this pawn from queening. So while the king is busy dealing with that pawn, we can start marching our king up to take these pawns. And there's really nothing black can do about this. Black can try to stay close to these pawns and not let our king through, but we're just going to march our passed pawn. And eventually, he's going to be stretched too thin. Let's start coming this way. Let's say he finally goes ahead and decides to take our pawn, but now we see how far away his king is. And this will now be an easy win. He is inside the square of the pawn, but this is an easy win. We'll talk about this later when we have the two connected passed pawns. I do want you to notice one thing, though. Let's go all the way back here. So a lot of non-chess players, one of their first questions they have for me when they find out I play chess is they'll ask me, how many moves ahead can you calculate? This is like a really popular question that non-chess players ask chess players. They want to know, how many moves ahead can you see? And of course, I always tell them it completely depends on the position. There's some positions where you do want to calculate very far ahead, and there's some positions where you really can't do that. But pawn endgames are the kinds of positions where you can calculate really, really far ahead. From this position right here, for example, I might not know every specific move, but I pretty much know what's going to happen from now to checkmate. I'm going to march this pawn, I'm going to advance my king towards these pawns. The king is going to try to defend both, but he's going to get stretched too thin. Eventually, he's going to have to go capture this passed pawn. I'm going to be capturing these pawns. I'm going to create a queen, and then I'm going to do the queen and king checkmate. So how many moves ahead is that? Maybe 20 moves more? So it's always kind of funny to me when people ask that question, because to me, this doesn't look hard at all to calculate this out to checkmate. And as we go through it, it probably won't be hard for you either. This is a pretty simplified position. It's easy to think ahead in these kinds of positions. But you'll have that piece of info to impress your non-chess playing friends when you can say that you can see 20 moves into the future. Now let's start covering these kinds of positions when there's only one pawn remaining on the board. It can't be used as a diversion. We know that if there were, some other pawns here, it'd be a pretty easy win for white. He could use his pawn as a diversion and go win the rest of our pawns. We talked about that kind of situation. But this is just a situation where there's only one passed pawn on the board. Our king is inside the square of the pawn. Our king is within this range. So what happens here? Can white win this, or can black actually make a draw? And it turns out that in this position, black can draw this game, even though black is down a pawn. And we're going to learn how right now. Now, before we learn this, I want to just go ahead and take a second to take a step back and talk about my philosophy when it comes to teaching these kinds of endgames. A lot of people might say something like, this isn't really a beginner topic, right? How many games between newer players to chess come down to a position like this, where one pawn makes the difference, right? Usually one player makes a mistake, they lose a piece, and the other player will have to convert one of those overwhelming positions we talked about in the last video, or make use of one of the basic checkmates. But how many positions between games of newer players come down to a situation like this? And this is true, so if you can't memorize everything I say in this video, don't worry about that. You've already got the endgame essentials down that are really going to benefit you, especially as a newer player. That's the winning overwhelming positions, winning queen and king versus king, rolling rooks. Those are what you really need to know. But I still like teaching this pawn endgames to beginners for a couple reasons. One, I feel like it helps them see the bigger picture of why they're learning some of the things they're learning. You've just learned how to do the queen and king checkmate, and pawn endgames are a big application of that, because the whole goal, usually in a king and pawn endgame, is to get that queen so you can do that checkmate. I also think it helps you value pawns more. A lot of beginners don't seem to really care if they lose a pawn when they're playing chess, and it just goes to show, in some of these positions, an extra passed pawn, if all the pieces get traded off, that makes a huge difference in the game. In a king and pawn endgame, usually that extra pawn is enough to win the game. It turns out not to be in this specific position, which we're going to talk about, but usually it is. So a pawn can be a pretty significant deal. And lastly, I just think it helps increase one's passion for chess. A lot of this stuff I think is really cool, especially as we get further into this video. Pawn endgames, the calculation is so precise a lot of times. There's not a lot of ambiguity when it comes to pawn endgames. You can calculate so deep, really see the position all the way out to its conclusion, and I think there's really an appeal to that. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about how we can draw this position if we're black here. We're down a pawn, but we can still draw because our opponent only has one passed pawn, we are inside the square of the pawn, and we can stop our opponent's king from getting in front of the pawn. When these things are true, we can make a draw. So I'll show you how. First, we want to stay as close to this pawn as possible. Really, our first square we'd really love to be on is the square right in front of the pawn. Because if we're on that square, our opponent's obviously not going to be able to make progress because we're blocking the pawn. So it's white's turn. If white were to play here, for example, we simply take up that square. That's the best square to be on. If our opponent moves their king forward, that's fine. So now we can't come to our favorite square, right? We can't come right in front of the pawn because, of course, the king would be able to take our king. That's an illegal move. So if you can't come there, the next best place to be is right in front of the king. Make this barrier, stop the king from getting in front of the pawn. So now, white either has to make some random king move, and if he does that, we know what to do, right? We go right in front of the pawn. Or he can push the pawn, and that's fine. In this position, we're able to get right in front of the pawn, so we do that. Now it's white's turn, and white's only move really is to move here. If white makes any other move, we just take the pawn and the game's over. It's a draw. So white's only chance is to keep defending this pawn. So now, we can't move here because we're already there. We'd love to say pass, but you can't do that in chess. And we can't move to the square right in front of the king because we're actually already there too. We're already 2 away from the king and we're making this barrier. So we'd love to pass, we can't pass, so the third option is to step straight back. Just remember that. The best place to be is right in front of the pawn. The second best place to be is right in front of the king, 2 squares away. And the third best place to be, if you can't do any of those things, is to step straight back. So we're going to go ahead and step straight back. And you'll see why this is important. So now it's white's turn. Again, if white makes any other move besides moving the king up, we just come right back to this square, and white makes no progress. So let's say white moves here. Pause the video if you want to think about what to do here. That's right, we move right in front of the king and stop that king from coming any closer. Let's have white make a random move. That's fine, we come right here. White moves here, straight back. White tries the other side, no problem. Step right in front of him. And he can keep dancing around until the position repeats 3 times, and if you've watched my rules video, you know that once the same position repeats 3 times, we can declare a draw. So okay, white tries to push the pawn right in front. White moves here. Again, we're already on our favorite square, we can't stay there, but we can step straight back. Now it looks like white's making progress and he's driving our king back, but this progress is really just an illusion. Black's fine here, the game's a draw. So white advances his king, same thing, right in front. And again, let's say white makes some random move, we come right back. He comes to the side, we step straight back. He comes up, we get right in front of the king. He makes a random move right in front of the pawn. Right? White can try to trick us, but as long as we remember the priorities, we'll be fine. The best place to be is right here, the second best place is right in front of the king, and the next best place is straight back. He comes here, we can't stay here in front of the pawn, we can't move here right in front of the king, so straight back. And again, we can dance forever until 3-fold repetition, or he can finally push this pawn one last time. And again, looks like he's making progress, but he's not. Here, white has no moves. White either has to abandon the pawn, when we would take the pawn and the game's a draw, or white can do what he's been doing and stay here, but this is stalemate. Remember again, in the rules video, we talked about stalemate. It's black's turn here. Black can't move here because of the pawn. Black can't move any of these squares because of the king. So black can just say he has no moves, and he's not in check. It's not checkmate, so the game's over. The game is a draw. Now, there's nothing white can do about this if black knows his stuff. But if you're ever the side that has the extra pawn in this situation, it's worth trying to trick your opponent. Let's say white plays here, and some players might get confused. I've seen players do this all the time. When they're newer to chess, they haven't practiced this a lot. They'll say, oh yeah, okay, king goes to this file, I know I'm supposed to go there too, and they play a move like this. That's the wrong move, right? Remember, the best place to be is right in front of the pawn, the second best place is right in front of the king, and the third best place is straight back. This square wasn't on the agenda. This is not right in front of the king, this is 2 squares away. And now you're going to have a problem. Now the king can advance, and now you have to move here, white pushes forward, and we get the exact same position as before. Remember when white had to move here and stalemate us, but there's a problem. It's not white's turn. It's black's turn in this position, because you made the moves out of order, and this isn't going to work out well for you. You do have a legal move here, and you have to make it, and now white is going to queen. So, very important to get those priorities right. Number 1 choice, right in front of the pawn. Second choice, right in front of the king with only 1 square in between. And the third best choice, straight back. That way you can easily adapt whichever side white goes to. Alright, next scenario. This time it's a little different. Same situation, only 1 pawn on the board. It is a passed pawn. The enemy king is inside the square of the pawn. But this time, we managed to get our king in front. So now we're going to be white here. What do you think? Pause the video if you want to think about it. Is this enough to win for white, or can black still draw this position if he plays right? So, actually, whether you said that you think white can win this, or whether you said you think that black can hold a draw here, you're actually not entirely right either way. The actual answer here is it depends whose move it is. And you actually do not want it to be your turn in this position. So let's go ahead and be white in this position. It's our turn. Let's think about what we can play. If we move to the side, the black king should step right in front of us. And it's already kind of clear here, we have no way to make progress. If we step further to the side, now the king just approaches the pawn, and we're going to have to come back and defend our pawn. We can't push it forward, and we don't want to run further away. And now our king's not in front of the pawn anymore. This is the same draw we know from before. Now our king's behind our pawn, and it's a draw. So that's no good. Let's go back to this position. Again, if we step back instead of to the side, same kind of problem. The king will never again get in front of the pawn, and we know this is a draw because of what we just looked at. So, we step to the side, the king steps right in front of us. We can step right back and repeat the position. There's just really no way to make progress. Your king's not going to be able to stay in front of this pawn, and black will make a draw. But let's say it's black's turn in this position. Black is in what we call Zugzwang. It's a German word which means compulsion to move. Again, black would love to just say pass, but black cannot pass. He has the move, he is compelled to move, and any move he makes is going to weaken his position. His king has to give way, and whichever side he moves to, our king will take the opposite path and start creating this path for the pawn. Now the king controls all these squares. Let's say it's black's turn here, and black moves back here. Think about what you'd do here if you were white. Pause the video if you want some time to think about this. So the most obvious move is to start advancing your pawn. This actually doesn't work though. Think about it. If we advance this pawn, now the black king will step in front of our king, and what do you notice about this? Now the kings are directly opposed, once again, but now it's white's turn, and we know that it's not good if it's our turn in this position. If we step away, the king starts approaching our pawn. If we step in front, we already know what this is all about, right? We got this same kind of position, but now it's white's turn. That's not what we want. So, let's go back a bit. Once again, black's turn here. He has to give way. Let's create the same situation again. This is called the opposition of the kings, when the kings are opposed like this by 1 square. And usually you don't want it to be your turn in this kind of situation. So don't push this pawn too soon. Just to recap, we went from this position. Black had to give way. We advanced. He tried to move back in front of our pawn. We created the same opposition again, and he has to give way again. Let's say he chooses that side. We come this way. Now it's safe to advance our pawn. So we go ahead and play d4. Our opponent's king has to move back because we're controlling all these squares. Now you wouldn't want to step here now, because if we move here, the black king can step up, and now our pawn can't advance, and we have to come back. So we're not ready for that yet. So, we can push the pawn though, because the king can't really get in front of our pawn anymore. If the king steps back here, we simply move our king up, and our king will control all the squares, including the queening square. That's what we want. And if the king tries to step in front of our pawn, we know that's not a problem, because we can create this opposition when it's black's turn. And this wins. Now the king has to give way one final time. Let's have them go the other way this time. We make room, and now we control all the squares. There's nothing black can do. He'll never be able to stop this pawn or capture it. this will become queen and king. Let's just go one more time from the beginning and see if black can do anything else. So it's black's turn here. He has to choose a side. Let's choose the other side this time. We advance. And last time we talked about if he tries to get back in front of the pawn and how we can create this opposition again. This time let's have him try to step up. Now we can advance the pawn. If he runs this way, he's just going to run out of the square of the pawn, probably. We're just going to be able to advance our king up. So he steps back. Now we don't want to advance the pawn, right? Because if we advance the pawn, he comes back and our king's not in front of the pawn. That's a draw. But we just keep boxing him out, right? Same kind of idea. He steps back, and we've already seen this kind of position. Now we can advance the pawn because we're not worried about him getting back in front. Because we know if he tries, we take the opposition. The kings are opposed when it's black's turn. Has to give way, and we make a queen. And one final thing our opponent can try. We looked at what happens if he chooses one side or the other. Let's say he goes straight back. This is even easier, right? We can just step forward, create the same opposition. He has to give way. I guess he could try to step back again, but we just, it's not going to help him. And our king is just going to help this pawn become a queen, and the king is not going to be able to stop it. All right, time for a quiz, time for a puzzle. So we have this position in front of us. Go ahead and pause your video and think about if white can win this, or if it's a draw for black, or if it depends whose turn it is. All right, if you're back, this is a win for white no matter what, actually, which might surprise you because we've talked about how when these kings are opposed, it really depends whose turn it is. But think about it. If it's black's turn here, we already know why this is bad for black. We've looked at almost this exact position. Black has to give way, the king, moves forward and helps the pawn advance. If it's white's turn here, though, white's not really happy with how the kings are, but white can just waste a move. White can move his pawn, and we've seen this position, right? The kings are opposed, it's black's turn, and black has to give way. So this is actually always the case when the king is more than one square in front of the pawn. If the king is more than one square in front of the passed pawn, it's always a win. If the king is not in front of the passed pawn, it's always a draw. And if the king is exactly one square in front of the passed pawn and the kings are opposed, it's going to depend whose turn it is. Now, real quick, one critical exception to all this is the rook pawns. With rook pawns, it's a lot easier to make a draw. This position is a draw. It turns out with a rook pawn, the other side doesn't even have to worry about your king advancing or how many squares the king is in front of the pawn. In fact, he can just run away from you. Let's just go ahead and make it black's turn here. Black can just run to the corner and stay there. And there's nothing you can do about it. Let's try to do the same thing we would do, for any other pawn. The problem is you're never going to be able to get to this square. You can't move diagonally up and to the left to this, I guess you'd call it the Z file. So you can try to push the pawn, but this king's just going to stay in the corner and there's not much you can do about it. You're never going to be able to force him out with your king. You're eventually going to have to push the pawn, and there's nothing happening there. It's just a stalemate. So that's just good to remember. If your opponent has one pawn left, but it's a rook pawn, you don't have to worry about any of this. Just get to the corner and stay there, and it's a draw. All right, ready for a harder puzzle? It's white's turn here. Go ahead and pause the video and think about if you think you can win this with white, and if you can, what would your plan be here, and what move would you make? Go ahead and pause. Okay, so this is a win for white, but you have to be careful. So let's talk about some of the plans you might have come up with. If you thought you could just go ahead and push this pawn and queen it with no help at all, of course that doesn't work, right? Because this king is inside the square of the pawn. If we move this pawn forward, the enemy king has to be able to step inside this square, and he is. And this is just a draw now, because our king's not going to be able to get in front of this pawn. Our king can try to help, but it's too late. Our king's not in front of the pawn, and we know why this is a draw. So, if you saw that, that's good. Let's say you tried to get your king in front of the pawn. Well, if you were too direct about it, it's not going to work. If you come up this way, the opponent's king gets in front, and we know this isn't good, right? We can step here, here. We get this key position, but it's our turn. We don't want it to be our turn. So if you thought to get the king in front, you had absolutely the right idea. You just have to be careful about which methodology you're going to choose to get it there. But as long as you avoided that, you should be fine as long as your goal was to get the king in front. I think there's actually a couple ways to accomplish this, but one is just to go the other way. We come around this way, and now we notice that the enemy king will not be able to get in front of our king and create that opposition. Let's say he steps here. Well, we know what this is, right? We've seen this position before. Now our king is helping to shepherd this pawn home to become a queen. The king can step back. We will, I think we push here, yes, because remember, we're not afraid of the king coming here, because we create the opposition. So, whenever you get this situation with your king on the side, helping to shepherd the pawn, you'll always have an answer to what your opponent's going to do. Just make sure you think about how to create that opposition. Make sure you never end up in that situation where the kings are opposed, but it's your turn, and now you don't win. As long as you keep that in mind, if you can get your king on the side like this and force your opponent to give way, it's a win. So, just an important thing to keep in mind from that position. You want the king in front of the pawn, and you have to make sure you don't end up in that situation where you lose the opposition battle. Alright, time for another puzzle. It's white's turn in this position, and think about what you think the result of this game will be. Alright, so if you're back with me, you might be thinking, Blake, you already showed me this. This is a situation where one side has a passed pawn, white does not have a passed pawn, right? None of these pawns are passed because there's pawns blocking their path to queening. And we know what's going to happen here. Black's going to use this pawn as a diversion. His king's going to come here and eat up all the white pawns while the white king's busy dealing with this guy. It's a win for black. And that would usually be true. But it turns out white has a special idea here called a breakthrough. So, white can start by playing this move b6, pushing this pawn forward, and you're going to like this. This is pretty cool. So, if black ignores this pawn, of course, that's not going to be good. White can go ahead and capture and make a queen. So, this has to be dealt with somehow. Let's say black goes ahead and captures this pawn. Now, white's going to play this move, a pawn sacrifice. And I think you're starting to see the idea, right? If black goes ahead and captures this pawn, white has created a passed pawn. He's sacrificed 2 pawns, but he's got a passed pawn that cannot be stopped, and white's going to win this game. He's going to make a queen long before black can. He's going to take all the black pawns and do the queen and king checkmate. And there's nothing black can really do about it. Let's go back. Let's say black takes the other way. Well, you probably know what's coming. White's going to play a6, advance the other pawn 1 square. And again, there's nothing black can do. Black can't allow the capture in queen, so he has to take that pawn, and now the other pawn queens. Again, this isn't an idea you're going to get the chance to use every day. It's not a situation that comes up all that often, but it is really nice when it does come up, and I think it really helps illustrate the beauty of chess. I thought this was a really cool idea when I first saw this, sacrificing those pawns. Now your opponent has 4 passed pawns and you have 1, but yours is the only one that matters because of how far advanced it is. And now if we go back to this position, and let's say white misses this opportunity. Let's say that white just plays a move like this. Think about what you'd play if you were black. Go ahead and pause the video if you want. Okay, so if you're black, of course, you were completely losing a move ago. White had a breakthrough idea that would have won the game for white. White missed it. What do you think? Can you do anything about it, or does white have another chance to find it this turn? I think there's a couple things you can do actually in this position. The simplest is you can actually play this move and this blocks all the breakthroughs. Now there's simply no more breakthrough idea. If white captures, you capture, just make sure to capture symmetrically, right? You don't want to, lead to white getting a passed pawn. And there's nothing white can do here to get a passed pawn. White can take, and we know how this is going to end. This is going to end with our pawn being a diversion and us winning the game. So let's just play it through so you can see what I mean. Let's start going for white's pawn. White can try to block us, but we're going to force him to deal with our passed pawn. And they will get our pawn, we will get their pawn, but now our king is way in front of our pawn. This is an easy win for black. So, b6 is one way to stop that breakthrough. I think black actually could have another way to stop this. I don't think it's as good, but you can play king to f6, and now I think the breakthrough doesn't work, because they will play here, we will take, and if white tries to create a passed pawn, the same method, they play here, we take, and they create a passed pawn. It actually doesn't work this time, because this is where the square is, right, and our king can get inside that square. And now this pawn's not actually making a queen, and now, of course, this is easily winning for black. Black has all the passed pawns. But that won't always work to stop that exact breakthrough, this 3-on-3 breakthrough. Playing b6 will always work. So, 2 ways that black could stop this if white misses his chance. Okay, it's time for another puzzle. It's white's turn here. Pause the video and think about how you would play here if you were white. Alright, if you're back with me, there's actually a lot going on here, and a lot of ways both players can really mess this up. So, objectively, the correct evaluation of this position is a draw, but there's several ways both players can mess this up. So, the worst move you could make here if you were white is to play here. which looks like the most natural move in the world, right? Going after the pawn. But it turns out, if you play here, black plays here, this is a position of mutual Zugzwang. Remember, Zugzwang means move compulsion. It means you would love to say pass, but you can't. You have to move, and any move you make is bad. Here, white's only moves are moves that abandon his pawn, right? He can't move here because of the black pawn, and there's no other square that defends his pawn, so the white king has to get out of the way. He will lose the pawn and the game, because the king is in front of the pawn, and our king does not have a way to create the opposition. So, we don't want to play king to e5, because of this mutual Zugzwang position. The king's going to defend his own pawn, and we're going to be forced away. The better idea is to play this a little indirectly. Come around this way to the pawn, which seems counterintuitive, but remember, we're not worried about black coming to attack our pawn. Why? Well, if the king moves here, we create the same position, but now it's black's turn. Black has to abandon his pawn, and we win the game. So, let's play king f5. Let's come indirectly to this pawn. Think about what you would do here as black. Well, you can't do the same thing. Let's say you come here. Now I come to attack your pawn, right, from the back. You have to defend your pawn, because if I take this pawn, I'm going to win the game. So now you have to defend your pawn, and now I step backwards and create the mutual Zugzwang position. Black has to move. Black doesn't want to move, but he has to, and we're going to take his pawn and win the game. So, you might be thinking this indirect method of going after the pawn by playing here, coming from the back, not stepping on this danger square until the black king is here. You might think this wins for white. Go ahead and pause if you want to and think about how black can still draw this game. So, black has a draw here. Remember, it's okay if black loses this pawn. You can draw down a pawn as long as the circumstances are right. So, black should not be coming around trying to get the white pawn. He's simply behind in that race. Black should simply step back. And it's fine if black loses this pawn. He can abandon this pawn, because as long as he can take the opposition, we know this is a draw. Right? So, the king steps here. Let's say white doesn't take the pawn right away. Let's say white plays a move like this. Now black has to be a little bit careful, right? We know that black would not want to make a move like this, because now we get this key position. It's black's turn. You don't want it to be your turn here. But black can either go defend the pawn again, or black can just dance around this square, right? White has to take this pawn if he wants to make progress. And black can just make moves like this. And if white ever takes the pawn, black's ready to step on this square. It's just important that black doesn't come to this square until the time is right. Here's the next position. Go ahead and pause if you want to think about it on your own. It's white's turn here. Okay, if you're back with me. So this is another kind of position where you have to watch out for this mutual Zugzwang idea. If white plays the most natural move, going after this pawn, it turns out this is not a good idea. Black will come and defend their pawn, and white is in Zugzwang. White has no move here that's good. White either has to move the king and abandon their pawn, right, because we can't come here. The pawn controls that square. Or, if white doesn't abandon this pawn, white's only other move is to move this pawn, and it will get captured, of course, and black will make a queen first. If you wondered, why can't white play a move like a4, right? Create their own passed pawn. Isn't white winning there, right? White has another passed pawn. If you thought that, remember, en passant, we're using our move of 2 of this pawn to bypass a square where another pawn can capture it. If we use our move of 2 in that manner, our opponent has a chance to capture our pawn as if it only moved 1 square. So black would win. Remember, if that's not clear, go back and watch my rules video. Very important to understand en passant. So, with that in mind, it's important to see why white doesn't want to make this move. The black king will step up, and white has no good moves here. White's going to lose a pawn and the game, no matter what they do. By the way, if you do lose this pawn, the game is over, because this pawn is going to be a diversion. We know how this goes, right? The black king is going to come and take all our pawns and march this guy to promotion while we're busy dealing with that guy. So we can't lose that pawn. So, what can white do? Can white go around and try to take your pawn? No, because if the white king strays too far, it's going to leave the square of this pawn. So if this starts happening, this king's just going to kind of sit tight, guarding this pawn, right? He's just going to stay at home, not doing too much. But the second this king goes too far, it's not too late yet, because if the pawn marches, we could still get inside its square here. Our king can step back. But if white ever takes this pawn, now we're too far. The black pawn's going to promote, and this is not good. We can try to race, but it's not going to work. Queen here, and take. And black will win. So, going back to this starting position, we see that king g4 is bad, because black will step up and we're in Zugzwang. We see that we can't go take the black pawn, because if we do, black's pawn will promote. We're too far away. So white really has nothing to do except just do nothing. And now it's black's turn. Similarly, black can't step up. Black cannot come attack our pawn, because if he does, now he's in Zugzwang. He has no pawn moves. He has to move his king away. We're going to take his pawn, use our pawn as a diversion, go grab this guy and win, right? So, if it's black's turn, thankfully for black at least, black can similarly do nothing. And it turns out both players have nothing better to do, except do nothing. And the game will be a draw. Unless one player decides to try to win, and then they will lose. So, keep those mutual Zugzwangs in mind. This is really unique to pawn endgames. No other situation in chess is like this, where it's so precise, these little movements. A completely natural move can just lose simply because you end up in Zugzwang like this. It's really interesting. Now, I hinted earlier in the video that we were going to talk about the power of connected passed pawns. Connected passed pawns are simply when you have two pawns, they're both passed pawns, and they are on adjacent files, like this. And these pawns are extremely powerful in king and pawn endgames for a couple reasons. One is that they actually support each other. So this sounds a little strange. We see how, for example, this pawn supports this guy, right? The king can't take this pawn because it's defended. It's illegal. But the king actually can't take the backwards pawn either. If the king takes the pawn in the back, it leaves the square of the front pawn. So let's go ahead and see what happens if black tries to do that. He's left the square of this pawn. This pawn's going to march forward and promote. So because black can never do anything to take these pawns, white kind of gets a free hand here. Black has to kind of sit tight. White has all the time in the world. White can go ahead and scoop up this pawn and then get his king over here to help out. The king can step here, but he can't really do anything. If the king ever goes too far, he'll be at risk of, well, I guess there's several things we could do. We could start marching our king over this way. We could start marching both the pawns. It's just not going to work. So we're going to just take his pawn and slowly come back. And now I do want to show you how to do this checkmate. With two pawns, it is always good enough. Two pawns against none like this. Barring any, particularly strange circumstances. Even if they are on the side of the board. It's hardest on the side of the board, which is why I set it up like this, just because you do have to worry about stalemate. But if you can do this, you can definitely do it with two central pawns. So I'll show you this way, and with central pawns it's even easier. So the king can do whatever he wants. We're just going to advance our king. The king has to move back because of the threat of the queen and pawn if he takes here. Our king is going to support. And we're just going to slowly advance these pawns. It's pretty intuitive how this works once you get the hang of it. So the black king will go here. We'll just have our king support. Push our pawn forward. We can go ahead and push forward like this. We don't really mind that he can step up because he's going to be forced back simply by the threat of this pawn queen. There's many ways to do this. There's not just one really formulaic way. Just always remember what I said in the last video. You always have to ask yourself, is this move stalemate? Right? Does my opponent have a move? So I'm always doing that when I'm making moves here. Never stalemate your opponent when you're winning, remember. So it's black's turn. We're just going to have our king support. The king's going to go back. Black's probably just hoping to get stalemated, right? That's really his only chance to save this game. Let's advance. The king will step here. And now there's a couple ways to do this. One that I might recommend is in this specific position, let's just go ahead and push the rook pawn forward, since that's the one kind of causing all the trouble. That's the one that leads to stalemates and all that kind of stuff. Let's have the king step here. Now be careful, right? You don't want to step to this square. If you step here, it's stalemate, right? The opponent has no legal moves, they're not in check, so it's stalemate. You don't want to throw away your win like that. So we're just going to come around, and he really can do nothing except go back and forth between these two squares. So we're just coming around. And now at the right time, we can just sacrifice this pawn, give it up, let him take that queen. He has to, right? Otherwise we just win using the king and queen method. And now we're simply going to come here. Because basically, we had two connected passed pawns. We sacrificed one to get a winning king and pawn versus king, because we just calculate that the king is going to get squeezed out here. He comes back, we advance the pawn, and we kind of get this key situation, if you remember from early in the video, when if it was white's turn here, it would be stalemate, but it's black's turn in this position. Black has to leave, and we're making a queen, and this is going to be a win for white. So it can be a little tricky in that corner there, might require a little creativity. Definitely always be careful of the stalemates. But it is true that two connected passed pawns against a lone king is always a win, no matter where they are, which files they are, it's always a win, no matter where your king is. Alright, here's the next position. It's white's turn here. Go ahead and pause your video if you want to think about this on your own. Okay, so white is winning here too, actually. Here, white is up a pawn, but his king's pretty far away from the action, and it looks like he's in danger of just having his pawn scooped up. But it turns out that split passed pawns can also support each other just like connected passed pawns can, under the right circumstances. So if it's white's turn here, just advancing your king would be a mistake, because black will be able to step up, and now there's really nothing you can do. You're going to lose this pawn, and this is not a win. Think about it if you want what this position is. It is a draw, because even though black is going to be able to win your pawn, or no, actually, sorry, he's not going to be able to win your pawn. But it's still a draw here, because he's going to use his pawn as a diversion. But even if he could win your pawn, it doesn't matter, because black can't win, because he has a rook pawn, right? I mean, with a rook pawn, you can just hide in the corner, and it's a draw. So this would be a draw. So king b2, or any advancement of the king would be a mistake. Instead, though, if white pushes this pawn forward, now, being on the same rank here, these two pawns are going to be able to support each other. Let's see how this works. If black tries to attack one of the pawns, the other pawn advances. And now, the king actually surprisingly can't win either of the pawns. He can't take the pawn in the back now, because this pawn would queen. The king would leave the square of the pawn. So the king has to step backward. And now our king can advance. Now the king can step back, or he can start advancing his pawn. It doesn't really matter. If the king tries to step back, though, what do? We advance the pawn, right? Because now he can't attack this pawn, because we're going to advance the other one and make a queen. So black really shouldn't move the king at this point, right? Because no matter what king move he makes, he's not going to be able to stop the other pawn from queening. These two pawns are supporting each other. So I guess he should just make pawn moves, but of course those are going to run out really fast, and now black has to move the king, and white will make a queen. So we saw that even with the king so far away from the action, those two split passed pawns were able to support each other. Finally, one more puzzle. It's white's turn here, and this position looks hopeless for white. Black has a passed pawn here that we're nowhere near close enough to be able to stop at first glance. Meanwhile, white has a passed pawn, but the black king is right by it, ready to gobble it up. Does white have any chance to save this game? Go ahead and pause your video and think about it if you'd like. So, this actually comes from a famous Endgame study. This was first published almost 100 years ago by Richard Reddy in 1921. So, the general gist of this position is this. If white tries to accomplish either of his goals too directly, he's going to lose, right? If white tries to stop this pawn from queening, that's not going to work. He's outside the square. And let's say he finally realizes this and says, oh, I better try to queen this pawn. That also doesn't work, because the enemy king is inside the square of that pawn, and white's no closer to catching up to this guy, and black's going to make a queen and win. So none of that seems to work. How can white possibly, avoid losing this game? It turns out that white can cleverly work towards both goals at once. He can work towards catching this pawn and promoting his own pawn at the same time. So here's the key. White should play king to f6. So white's threatening to come here and get in the square of this pawn, and then the game would be an easy draw, right? If white could get in the square of this pawn, he would easily capture it, black would easily capture white's pawn, and white would be able to draw the game. So this pawn has to push forward, and now white can play this move. Notice the geometry going on here. It turns out that coming 1, 2, 3, 4 like this, that's no faster than coming 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. In chess, the fastest way between 2 points, it's not always a straight line. The king is not penalized here for taking diagonals, like you might kind of intuitively expect, which is kind of the beauty of the whole thing. So now, white's threatening here to come inside the square of the pawn. If black pushes the pawn, which is the only way to avoid this, first let's just see, if black tries to come here and stop the white pawn, now the king is in the square of the pawn and it's a draw, right? We've talked about that. And if black keeps pushing this pawn, Okay, now white says, okay, it is too late to come get this guy, but now I can change direction. I can come here and support my own pawn. And now the king can't stop you. Black can push the pawn, but white's going to make a queen too, and this game's going to be a draw. The king can step up, but that's no help. White can actually afford to make one more king move. And now both players have nothing better than to make queens. And the game will be a draw. Both players will have a queen, and it's queen and king against queen and king. That should be a draw. Alright, so we covered a lot in this video. We talked about many different techniques in pawn endgames, and they can actually get a lot more complicated than that in situations where both sides have multiple passed pawns. One side has connected passed pawns, the other side has split passed pawns. There's all kinds of complexity that king and pawn endgames can get to. And again, you don't have to know all of this right now in your chess career. You know the basics of endgames. A lot of this I showed you because not only will it come in handy later, you will want to know it, but I think a lot of it is just really cool. A lot of these breakthrough ideas, a lot of these mutual zugzwang positions, I just think they're really awesome and really help highlight the beauty of chess. Especially that study there by Reddy at the end. That was really cool. Blew my mind the first time I saw that. I thought white had no chance in that position, and white manages to draw. But before we step away, let's take a step back and just talk about where we are right now when it comes to endgames. These are the only 2 endgame videos in my Getting Started series. So what do you know right now about endgames? We know how to convert advantages we accumulate earlier in the game into wins. That's really the biggest thing. If you have a big advantage, if you have many more pieces than your opponent, you know how to convert that into a win. You know how to do basic checkmates with either rolling rooks, or a queen and king against a king, or a rook and king against a king. That's really huge, and that's going to be huge, all throughout your chess career. What you've learned about pawn endgames, though, a lot of it does have some pretty serious practical implications. For example, I want you to have the confidence that, let's say you're not up tons of pieces and you get one of these overkill, overwhelming positions. Let's say you're just up a pawn. Now you have the confidence that if you're able to exchange off all the pieces, you're probably going to be able to win that pawn endgame using what we talked about. You can go ahead and start advancing pawns, try to create a passed pawn, use it as a diversion. You know some techniques now that are going to be able to let you win some games, even if you only have one extra pawn. Of course, you shouldn't play directly, okay, now I won a pawn, now my goal is to exchange, all the pieces off the board, right? Just doesn't quite work so directly. But it's an idea, you can have that in the back of your mind. You should be confident that if you have that extra pawn, that could be enough to convert into a win if your opponent doesn't make anything special happen. If your opponent just goes blindly along, trades off all the rest of the pieces with you, and leaves you with an extra pawn, you can usually win with that in those pawn endgames. Also, if you get some other endgame, let's say it's not a pawn endgame, but let's say both sides have some pawns left, and maybe both player has a rook left, you're going to know, is it good for me to go into the pawn endgame, or is it bad for me? Should I be looking to trade rooks here, or should I really be avoiding the trade of rooks? Let's say that, both of you have some pawns on one side of the board, but your opponent has a passed pawn on the other side, and you both have a rook left. You probably know, oh, I shouldn't trade rooks right now because that outside passed pawn over there, that guy's going to win for my opponent in a pawn endgame. It's going to use the diversion technique. So I should not exchange rooks. I should keep rooks on the board. I know I'm down a pawn, but I have a lot better chances to draw this in a rook endgame than I do if I go down to the pure pawn endgame. Or conversely, if you're up a pawn or you have a passed pawn that you think would win in a pawn endgame, you can use that to your advantage. You can use your knowledge here and say, how can I transition this into a pawn endgame? Is there a way for me to trade the last piece off and go to the pawn endgame? So you have a lot of tools now at your disposal for winning in the late phases of the game. And not to be overlooked, you also have some tools now to draw positions where you have a disadvantage, like some of those king and pawn versus king positions, where you now know how to hold a draw if you have the disadvantage there. That's very important. Knowing how to turn disadvantages into draws, knowing how to escape and not let your opponent win those positions, that becomes bigger and bigger kind of the higher up you get in chess. So, thanks for watching. You're definitely far ahead of most other beginners now when it comes to your in-game knowledge. Thank you for following along with this series. Please check out the website, chesspathways.com. Sign up for the list. I want to be there for you, help you in your chess journey, and I'll see you again next time.